The Silver Fox is our classic serial, and you can hear part 2 at 9 o'clock here on Radio 4. But first, it's time for the Archive Hour, and Libby Purves takes an affectionate look back at 40 years of hometown broadcasting in Close to Home, the story of local radio.
29018, reader 1 of 2.
This is your local BBC station serving Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole.
At 8 o'clock, Barney Bamford will be down your street, and this morning it's the turn of Barnfield Pinkhull.
In the early 1960s, as cautious and unimpressive as the first primroses, those voices prefigured the coming of BBC local radio. It was a series of experiments launched in 16 towns and cities across the UK to test whether local radio was possible or desirable.
Some results from the East Dorset Croquet Club's annual tournament at Parkstone. Handicap singles, the first round, C.M. Pinney beat Mrs. E.M.K. plus 11.
These experiments were never broadcast and the recordings gathered dust, but without those tentative beginnings, we wouldn't now be celebrating 40 years of BBC local radio.
It's 11 o'clock and time for 11s.
Colonel D.W. Beamish beat Mrs. Creed Meredith plus 21.
We have done plays in local dialect. We once did one about mining. It wasn't popular, in spite of the fact that somebody had a bath on the stage.
Mrs. Fitter beat Mrs. Fitling plus 7.
Molly, do you think people from other parts tend to look on Norwich people as rural dolts?
Oh, they do. And they're always complaining because we're flat and uninteresting.
Canon Creed Meredith beat Major Hill Bernard, retired hurt.
Yes, OK, it does sound like a spoof. But it was the seed of BBC local radio, which since then has informed and amused and brought communities together. It put new voices on the air and incidentally shook up the stolid world of network radio. It brought you the likes of Kate Adie, Tony Adamson, Michael Burke, Paul Heine, Des Lynam and me. Though I have to admit that the first time I ever read the news on Radio Oxford, 2 listeners rang in to ask, why is that little boy reading the news? I think I was further up the octave then. But for the real beginning of the story, we have to go back another 40 years to the 1920s when broadcasting was first born. Because actually, local radio came first. When the British Broadcasting Company, as it then was, started out, they weren't technically sure of themselves enough to go national, so they launched with a series of local services around the country. It began with 2LO in London in November 1922, quickly followed by 5IT in Birmingham and 2ZY in Manchester, with another 16 opening up during the next 2 years. Broadcasting a few hours a day on medium wave, the outstations mostly relayed programmes from London. But once a week they would turn over the airwaves to musicians and variety acts from their own towns. John Snagge, later a venerable wartime announcer and voice of the boat race, was on 6ST in Stoke-on-Trent. His memories are strangely familiar to those of us who served on local stations decades later, except with a commercial twist.
You had to do everything yourself. They were homemade programmes. The sort of thing was that I used to sing duets with the engineer in charge. I mean, these are, fatuous when you think of it nowadays. You had to persuade people really to buy a licence. We were commercial in that respect. Buy a licence, that's what you've got to do.
And in the 20s, it wasn't just the embryonic licence fee that made the BBC its money. It also sold wireless sets for income. And its leaders shrewdly calculated that the best way to get listeners to buy radios was through their children. Thus, for an hour a day, each station broadcast its own custom-made children's hour. In 1949, some aunties and uncles from the Leeds and Bradford station 2LS got together to reminisce. Here they are, George Lister, Doris Nichols and Max Kester.
The thing that amazes me as I look back is that at first we often went into the studio for the children's hour with nothing arranged. Literally nothing.
You know perfectly well, George, that although we made it up as we went along, we all rather enjoyed it.
Aye, Uncle Philip, we did. Do you remember the time we pretended to put Uncle Bob in the piano and had a thunderstorm?
Oh, the children complained bitterly at the way we treated him, and the thunder frightened some of them.
Well, of course they didn't know it was an old thunder sheet. You know, a big sheet of iron hanging from the studio ceiling,
We had no recorded sound effects in those days.
Oh, I was always itching to shake it during a programme.
Were you? Well, now's your chance to do it again. We've dug it out of the attic specially for you.
Oh, I haven't seen one for 20 years. Aha, here goes.
And, of course, the old coconuts for horses.
Whoa, back, Neddy.
Whoa. It was all very, very simple and childish, but it was a beginning.
By the late 1920s, the BBC had started to get the hang of national and regional broadcasting, and these smaller stations and their cheerful amateur spirit died out. So local broadcasting, hometown radio, lay dormant for the next 30 years, until one determined man resurrected it.
The average individual living outside London has a considerable interest in world affairs, especially in the big issues of life and death. He has a considerable interest too in regional matters, and particularly so where the region is a nation, as with Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. But an interest which moves him in many cases just as much as the other two is the local interest. You see, it's the local community which is most real to him. He feels that in his own city he really is somebody.
That was Frank Gillard, a veteran BBC war correspondent who had broadcast from the Normandy landings. By 1960, he was controller of the BBC's South West region, and he later became managing director of BBC Radio, overseeing the creation of radios 1, 2, 3 and 4. But he had a feel for small-scale broadcasting with its vigour and idiosyncrasy. Matthew Linfoot from the University of Westminster is working on a history of BBC local radio.
BBC programmes had become very metropolitan, very London-centric. And he understood that the regions really contributed to what he called the ecology of culture, the kind of national culture that came out of the regions. But it's also interesting in the way that the regions began to feed into film and television, the arts. People were more interested in the provinces from the late 50s, the early 60s onwards. So this was part of a broader movement. Frank Gillard went to America in the mid-50s on a sabbatical. He visited a range of stations in 1954, and one of them that really impressed him was a small community in Pennsylvania which served a population of just 13,000. There were a staff of 13, and he wrote that it spoke to its listeners as a familiar friend and neighbour. And he realised that big battalion broadcasting was declining. So he brought these ideas back and started to lobby within the BBC for a different way of looking at broadcasting.
Few people had any idea what local radio would sound like, and metropolitan elitism is always hard to crack. Gillard had his work cut out to convince people inside the BBC and out. In July 1960, the Pilkington Committee was set up to consider the future of broadcasting. The Post Office wouldn't allow the BBC to broadcast pilot stations, so it ran a series of closed-circuit experiments. They had to simulate live broadcasts but not go out on air. Gillard hoped that recordings of these dummy runs would provide evidence to support his dream, a local station in every town. One of the 16 locations selected was Stoke-on-Trent.
Good morning. This is Radio Stoke, your local BBC station. Before the national news from London, a word about one or two of today's programmes. At 10:15, today's talking point is about the pulling down of the centre of Penkhull village.
Not exactly a Stoke accent there, perhaps something chosen more to reassure the mandarins back in London. Anyhow, during 1961 and 1962, armed with £6,000 from the BBC coffers, Gillard masterminded the big experiment. He wanted to see how it would be if little stations relayed news and information with a new kind of intimacy, free from central interference. And he looked for a tone far removed from national broadcasting, which at the time still tended to sound as if the presenters wore starched collars or, if female, hats with net on the front. So, simulated newsrooms and broadcast studios were set up in hotels, libraries and town halls, sometimes for just a few days.
It's not at all as most people would think. It's not going to be a long flow of pop music with the occasional news headline thrown in. This is going to be a service to provide a tremendous amount of information and satisfy a lot of different interests. There'll be local weather forecasts, information about what's on in the town, sports coverage, prices of things like vegetables and meat, or anything you'd like to know about what's happening in your town.
John Johnson from the Pool Experiment. Some staff volunteered to take part in these dummy stations, a few were dragooned into it. In 1961, Michael Barton, later to be Radio Sheffield's first station manager, was a young producer in Manchester.
I was called up, as it were, from my production job in Manchester to go to Hull, my own hometown. It was a lash-up studio with very, very basic equipment in the Guildhall, which is, you know, the town hall. And we would have reports from reporters around the place, some, you know, going to the market and reporting on what the good catches were of the day, what fish to buy. Somebody back in the studio doing recipes, immediately saying, oh, well, if it's cod today is cheap, this is what you can do with your cod. It was fun. It was very inventive. But nobody was listening to it, apart from those who were invited, local city fathers and a few MPs perhaps. And, of course, the man himself, Frank Gillard, sitting and listening and recording everything.
A routine fire drill at Boots the Chemist in the Broad Street was too realistic for one member of the staff this morning. He forgot the drill was scheduled for today, and when the bells rang through the store, he picked up the telephone and called the fire brigade.
News was a priority. You can always make a case for news. But beyond that, the dummy stations could do just about anything according to the taste of their ad hoc staff. There were local events, sports fixtures, religious, education programmes, council meetings. Radio Portsmouth even included Maternity Watch.
Well, today, being Wednesday, we have news of the babies. Well, we usually get about 100 babies a week in Portsmouth. This week the total's 93, 7 below. And of that number, 61 were born in the St Mary's Hospital. 41 boys were born in St Mary's, 20 girls. And the heaviest of the week is a girl, and she weighed 10 pounds. The lightest was a boy who weighed only 3 pounds. Don't get worried about him, he's in the incubator and he's doing jolly well. And the popular boy's name this week is Stephen, and the popular girl's name is Linda.
And you can't do broadcasting without politics, on a small scale, obviously.
Party Line, a monthly programme in which leaders of the political parties on the Stoke City Council discuss the things they don't agree about. The programme is introduced by Michael Barrett.
Yes, that Michael Barrett.
Most people, I think it's true to say, believed that local radio is just a joke. It would never happen. Who wanted it, for goodness sake? For me, it was a great experience. It was a new chance to break new ground and to learn more about broadcasting, indeed about broadcasting that in its way hadn't happened yet.
Well, gentlemen, good evening, and I think there are plenty of topics to talk about this week. I found myself...
We sat there at their desks with a couple of microphones plonked on them, and it was really, really very basic indeed.
...sort of thing. I was talking about the anger that some of the traders are feeling about the redevelopment of Longton. Now, Councillor Ellerton, I think this is one of your hobby horses, isn't it?
Yes, well, we can blame the council for not letting the public know the true position of Longton.
Alderman Bennett, you're under fire here.
Aye, but surely Councillor Ellerton doesn't suggest that we've been inactive when he's been so docile himself.
One of the big problems, of course, was filling time, acres and acres of time. And so we covered some of the most ludicrous stories. I remember doing a piece one day in which we said that somebody had found a hole in a road in Stoke. And we must have gone on for 20 minutes about this hole, how it appeared, what it was for, what were they going to do to it, and when were they going to repair it, and who was going to repair it. I mean, it was just a joke, but it filled 20 minutes.
Just as the 1920s broadcasters had cunningly targeted children, these fledgling stations realised that they had better dilute the heavy alderman with things aimed at women. 1960s women.
Well, I've decided to devote the whole of my programme this morning to a discussion on women's fashions in the potteries. And with me in the studio are Mrs. Margaret Watson and Mrs. Jean Wood, both from Stoke, Mr. Doherty, General Manager of Lewis's, and Mr. Stanley Dyke, one of the directors of Bratton Dyke.
Radio Stoke's show Elevenses with Sheila Bailey.
But first, I'd just like you to hear some of the things the menfolk of Hanley would like to, how they'd like to see their women dressed.
I like to see a girl in, a skirt, not too short, but a short skirt. When dancing, I like to see them in a tight skirt. I think it's better than a short skirt.
What's smarter in Stoke-on-Trent than anywhere else in the country?
How can you justify saying that?
Well...
I'm not disbelieving you, mind you.
I've been down London, and down there they all seem to be high and mighty, and snobs, and I think Stoke-on-Trent about the best.
Mrs. Watson, do you think the average woman's well-dressed here?
No, not terribly. I think they wear skirts sticking right out above their knees when London girls are wearing tight skirts. They're just a few months behind the times.
Listening to those voices, note the vox pops. And remember that in the 60s, the idea of inviting passers-by to have their say was virtually unknown on the networks. Local broadcasters could take more risks, get closer to people, and bit by bit they did. When they got a good story, these stations demonstrated what local radio would become in future years. This is from the Hull experiment.
I'm sitting in a room which is 12 feet square. Just through a door on my right is the tiniest little cupboard of a kitchen I've ever seen. Above this room is a bedroom 12 feet square, and that is the entire house. But in it, I find a mother, a father, and 8 children. Now, Mrs. Doris Lowthorpe, how long have you lived in these conditions?
11 years we've lived here.
And how old are you now, Mrs. Lowthorpe?
33.
And your husband?
42.
And what's his job?
He's a fish worker.
And how much does he earn a week?
About £9.5.
Now, what rent do you pay then for this house?
6 and 8 pence halfpenny.
Are you on the house waiting list?
Yes, I've been on about 3 years.
Now, how on earth do you manage to get all these children into this house, and particularly into this one tiny little bedroom?
Well, I have to manage, haven't I? Can't do nothing else.
Well, there it is. This is the conditions under which one family is living in this city in this year of 1961.
Well, of course, it is our policy to hear both sides of every question. And the Hull Corporation housing manager, Mr. T. Cuthbert, has come to the studio to discuss the problem of the Lowthorpes and others in the same position.
Now, Mr. Cuthbert, why should Mrs. Lowthorpe have to live under those conditions?
Well, Mr. Goodrich, I'm very sorry for Mrs. Lowthorpe, but you have to bear in mind that there are 17,000 people on the Hull waiting list. And Mr. Lowthorpe registered for housing accommodation on the 17th of September 1958, which means that there are 11,000 people registered prior to Mr. Lowthorpe.
A young freelance reporter was approached to take part in the London experiment, which ran from February the 15th to the 17th, 1962. His name was David Dimbleby. To him, as to dozens of others, the new way of working was a jolt. Decades before the Murdoch Revolution made print journalists learn to put their stories on the page without typesetters, these broadcast staff had to go technical, learn about knobs and faders, and operate the studio themselves. Not to mention the newfangled radio car.
I remember driving it to Hyde Park, and the instructions were to pump up the telescopic aerial, which was fixed to the back of the car with a sort of hand pump, like pumping up a tyre, right? And when it got up 6-7 feet, you left it and you went back into the car where your microphone and the tape machine were and begin the interview. So I did that and was broadcasting merrily away when I saw in the mirror that the telescopic aerial was slowly slipping, sliding down. And that in about 30 seconds, I wouldn't be on air at all because there'd be no signal going out. So I thought, well, this is perfectly easy to solve. And I sort of went on talking to the person I was with and at the same time got out of the side door of the car, went round to the back, thinking I'd be able to pump it back up again, but discovering that it was actually just out of reach, tantalizingly out of reach. So I had the microphone and could broadcast, but if I wanted to be heard broadcasting, I had to drop the microphone and pump the thing up again. And I've no idea how it was resolved. All I remember was being stretched with one arm out trying to keep this damn thing up, and the other trying to do an interview, stretching my left hand out with the microphone.
Lincoln Shaw was a television and radio journalist for the Midland region when he was asked to take part in the Stoke experiment.
When I arrived, I was told a news service would be provided, and it turned out to be carbon copies of stories that had been in the paper the day before, brought in by an elderly freelance who thought that's what we wanted. Well, of course, we didn't. I think you took more chances because you knew that it wasn't live and it wasn't going out to a local audience. We were a small team. We all knew each other because we were all volunteers from the Midland newsroom. It was good fun.
I'm sort of ashamed, I suppose, to say that on one Saturday programme we did a presentation about church activities.
Mere Parish Church has just altered the timing of morning service on Sundays. The time is now 10:30, and the reason that mothers need more time to prepare Sunday lunch.
To allow mothers more time to prepare lunch? My goodness, we'd be handed out to the country if we did that today.
So from all of us here at Radio Stoke, pleasant listening and see you tomorrow.
All this was a closed-circuit experiment. There were no listeners. But when it was over, Frank Gillard made up a compilation of the best tapes and played them to the Pilkington Committee. They liked it. In 1962, Pilkington recommended a service of local broadcasting provided by the BBC and financed by the licence fee. The Conservative government ignored this and focused on recommendations for a second television channel and more hours of network radio.
My guess is that they didn't get it. My guess is that this is the dying days of the Macmillan government, who weren't really in tune with what was going on the ground. Don't forget as well that there was a sizable lobby for commercial radio at this time. So ideologically, politically, the Conservative government will be more inclined to break the BBC's monopoly of sound broadcasting and allow commercial competition.
I felt, and a lot of people within the corporation, and indeed some of the public felt, that this experiment at the BBC's was actually a PR gimmick.
Well, we're about to have a BBC Radio London, and what do you think that can do to foster the
Well,
community spirit?
I think it's well worth trying out. And I think it should certainly be done by the British Broadcasting Corporation and none of these commercial johnnies knocking about.
And the best way to stop them was to start its own pilot service to show that if radio locally ever came, and they didn't think it would, but if it ever came, then the BBC were the people to do it.
By 1966, the Labour government under Harold Wilson was more receptive to the idea of communities having local broadcasting. Frank Gillard was back in the race. A white paper authorised the BBC to make a start. The deal was that there would only be 9 stations and that it would be a 2-year experiment with no extra money. But at least this time it would be broadcast. People could hear it. In January 1967, Frank Gillard held a meeting at Broadcasting House, inviting delegates from 80 authorities in England and Wales to consider having a local radio station in their town.
Frank addressed this gathering of the city fathers, leaders of councils, chief executives, town clerks, and so on. Not a note in his hand, and he played extracts from all these programmes that had been recorded on closed circuit around the country. And he had the meeting out of his hand. Very few people wanted to see the licence fee eroded further by paying for experimental radio stations. And he persuaded these local authorities to cough up the money. Or indeed anybody who was willing to put money towards the experiment. In Durham, for example, it was the police who, I think it was £10,000 they gave. I was asked to go to Sheffield, and the local authority there gave us £50,000 for the 2 years of the experiment. So it was pioneering time, and Frank, virtually alone, persuaded his colleagues in the BBC that this was the way forward.
Gillard's dream was taking shape. With local authority backing, the first stations, Leicester, Sheffield and Merseyside, launched in November 1967.
Good afternoon from Radio Leicester, broadcasting on 95.05 VHF.
Long ago when we were young and free.
No, we haven't got our lines crossed. That's the sort of sound that's going to become familiar to thousands of people in Leicester from November the 8th.
Frank Gillard invited the managers of these inaugural stations for a pep talk. They were the late Maurice Ennals of Radio Leicester and Michael Hancock of Merseyside, and Michael Barton, who was to run Sheffield.
The three of us were invited by Frank as his sort of personal envoys, really, to his flat in Hallam Street at the back of Broadcasting House, where he lived. Frank was a bachelor, and he lived for his work. And he invited us around for drinks, and there was a bust of Field Marshal Montgomery on the piano. I think he played the piano, Frank. And he gave us some words of wisdom. He said, "You're going to be out there alone. We will not be listening to you in London because we can't. There's no way we can pick up those signals. And I always remember Frank Gillard saying, do not be afraid of failure. Just go and do it. Experiment, experiment, experiment.
Of course, the bigger event of 1967 was the launch of Radio 1, a grumpy response to the success of the pirate stations and the renaming of radios 2, 3 and 4. Local radio, meanwhile, prepared for its multiple openings with quiet ingenuity and with a certain wit. Sheffield wooed its potential listeners with a homage to the steel industry, a knife, fork and spoon symphony composed in the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. Meanwhile, Merseyside, with equal determination, decided to bring out the big guns and play to its strengths.
By Jove, just what we wanted. Radio Notty Ash. It's tatty-hilarious. It's full of plumptiousness, and I'm completely discom-knockerated. All the Diddy men are completely discom-knockerated, missus. Radio Merseyside. That's the stuff, boys. Ha-ha! Yeah, ox. Well. Radio.
Ken Dodd and a jingle composed by Jerry Marsden. How could it fail? But once again, as in the 1920s, the stations knew they had to persuade people to buy the necessary.
Radio Sheffield is with you today. Don't delay. Get your VHF radio, be ready to say, we get Radio Sheffield in our house each day.
This, you see, was a problem. The local radio stations were only available on VHF, very high frequency, now known as FM, and most people only had medium and long-wave radios. Radio Oxford, I remember, had a rather desperate slogan, join the VHF set, even though by then we did have a whistly, crackly medium-wave frequency as well. But the early stations had to get VHF sets on every breakfast table as soon as possible after opening, or before.
Radio Sheffield 88.6 VHF today.
This is BBC Radio Leicester. Good afternoon from Radio Leicester, broadcasting on 95.05 VHF.
Radio Leicester was first on air. It launched on November the 8th, its call sign the Morse code signal for Leicester set to music. Like all of the first stations, it opted in and out of network radio, producing only a few hours of its own programmes. Its first premises were to be a former mortuary, which discouraged the 16 staff a bit. That was abandoned in favour of something called Epic House. Ken Warburton was one of the four main presenters.
Epic House itself was a 1960s build. I believe it received some award for architecture. Goodness knows how. It was the worst form of 60s build you could ever imagine. We had two studios, one which was the on-air studio. We had air conditioning, except when you opened the air conditioners, the windows, you did get rather a lot of traffic noise from the street, so it was best to keep them closed. It was a poky little main studio, half the size of most people's living rooms, to be perfectly honest, but it worked. And again, although you were broadcasting in your vest because it was so hot in the studio, you coped. It was part of the fun. It was part of, I suppose, being pioneers.
Here is the Postmaster General, the Right Honourable Edward Short.
This is the first hometown radio station in Britain. It opens a new and, I think, exciting chapter in the story of British radio. No blueprint has been laid down. They've not been given any instructions except that the station should never forget it is hometown radio with its own Leicester individuality, and that it must always be bright and attractive.
And now here's the first bulletin of local news, read by David Chalice.
Thank you, Michael. In a few minutes, the Lord Mayor will be leaving Epic House here for the Lord Mayor's rooms, where he'll be giving a luncheon to mark our opening. Incidentally, half an hour ago, before we went on the air, we had an anonymous telephone call saying there was a bomb on the premises and it would go off at 1 o'clock. Leicester Police also received a similar message and they're now investigating.
I know that on the first evening I made my broadcasting debut on tape with a programme called Down to Earth, which, funny enough, was a gardening programme. Just hearing yourself on the radio for the first time was a thrill that I can still recall. It wore off very quickly, obviously, but it was something that sent a bit of a shudder down the spine.
Now, for our next request, Mrs. Phyllis Marchant of 52 Avebury Avenue near Anstey has come into the studio to introduce it herself. Good evening, Mrs. Marchant.
Good evening.
It's good of you to come along. Are you a Leicester person?
No, I come from London originally.
I see. And you like it?
Yes, I like Leicester very much.
What would you like us to play for you this evening?
Something from The Sound of Music, Edelweiss, please.
Edelweiss? Well, here it is, sung by Vince Hill.
Still not quite at ease, but doing their best. A week after Leicester, Radio Sheffield got on air, in a house that once belonged to the Lord Mayor, complete with ballroom.
This is BBC Radio Sheffield on 88.6 VHF. Good morning. My name's Jack Thompson. The day, Wednesday, November the 15th, 1967. The time, 1 minute to 6. Well, it is according to my studio clock here at number 60 Westbourne Road.
Michael Barton remembers that day well.
The first day was very nerve-wracking. We decided to go on the air at 6 o'clock in the morning, and one of the presenters, who wasn't familiar with abbreviations terribly, and certainly at that time in the morning, the first story was an accident on the M1. But unfortunately, Jack, who was reading the news that morning, called it the MI. He said, we've had reports of a serious accident on the MI. And everyone looked at each other and thought, what the heck's he talking about?
The programme linked up to the Today programme on Radio 4, still in the hands of Jack DeManio. And it introduced to the disbelieving DeManio the idea of the phone-in, the alarming notion of actually encouraging listeners to call in with their concerns.
We've been doing this programme here, the Today programme, now for about 10 years. We're now starting our limbs. And I think we have a certain amount of problem trying to fill it effectively every day. How are you going to cope with a local station?
This use of the telephone we think will help because we're trying to tell people as much as possible that if they've just heard a local councillor say something which they consider wrong, stupid or silly or even good, get on the phone and tell us, and they can be as angry or as nice as they like. We don't care.
One of the most ambitious phone broadcasts later on that day was by the late Ted Gorton, who eventually became a Today editor in London and then manager of Radio Oxford. He had breakfast with Mrs. Dorothy Revel, whose son Derek was in the services, stationed in Cyprus.
Mrs. Revel, you're a very busy woman. You've got to go off to work and so on and so forth. Ooh! And it's 8:15, yes. I'm afraid that clock's just a little slow. And I see all round the room, too, you've got pictures and so on. Who's that picture of over there, that one over there?
That's of my son, Derek, in Cyprus.
Have you heard from Derek lately?
I had a letter on Monday.
Did you?
Yes.
Well, I don't know if you know, but obviously you won't. But we hope very much that Derek is sitting in Cyprus, listening to you now.
Oh,
and we hope very much that Derek can hear us.
Oh, I hope so.
Well, let's see. Hello, Derek in Cyprus. This is Ted Gorton sitting in your mother's home. Can you hear us?
Hello, this is Derek.
Go on then, say hello.
Hello, Derek.
How's it going back in England?
Talk to him.
Is it nice out there?
Yes, watching.
Oh, well. I wish I were there.
You looking forward to seeing me?
Yes, I am. I can't wait for the 15th to come.
You'd like to say bye-bye, listener.
Bye-bye, Derek. Look after yourself.
Well, there you are. That was Derek Revel joining us from Cyprus. Back to you, Jack, in the studio.
Hello, Mike. Ted?
Yes?
What a stupendous link-up that was. Would you ask Mrs. Revel what she'd like for a request record?
You can ask her yourself, mate. She's sitting here listening to you and
hello,
loving every
Mrs.
minute
Revel.
of it.
Hello,
Jack.
Mrs. Revel.
Jack's his name, Mrs.
Hello.
Revel.
Hello, how are you, love?
All right, thank you.
Wasn't that tremendous,
Oh,
eh?
it was. I was shaking like a leaf here.
Good stuff. Look, love, what would you like us to play for you in a few minutes?
What they call it? Engelbert.
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 And the rest, Engelbert the rest.
Humpadunker, yes.
Yes,
Humpadunker.
that's it. I could never say that name.
Which one would you like of his?
Which one? Release Me, was it?
Release Me, yes.
Release Me. Right, Release Me. We'll have that for you in a few minutes, OK?
And I'm just going off
to see... It's ready now, is it? It's ready now.
Oh, well, here it comes,
My
Mrs.
producer's
Revel.
shouting down. So here it comes. Release Me by Engelbert Humperdinck for Mrs. Revel, especially.
This is BBC Radio Merseyside.
One week after Sheffield came Merseyside. Its home was Commerce House, St Thomas Street, in the heart of Liverpool. Jim Black from Network Radio came in as a senior producer and presenter.
There were only a couple of us who'd come from network radio, as it were. The rest were, theatre people, school teachers, journalists off the Catholic Herald. I mean, it was a very diverse group of people who came together, but a group of people who were well-rooted in the Merseyside area. We'd been on air with test transmissions, of course, but on that first day, Michael Hancock had the most ambitious plans.
My name is Michael Hancock, station manager of Radio Merseyside, and we're broadcasting from the heart of Merseyside, from Commerce House, Liverpool. Out now by radio link to our reporting team, in the air, on the river and underground. I'm sorry we can't go to the beacon where Jerry Harrison should be, so on we go now to the second Mersey Tunnel.
Never mind, it did the job, it captured the imagination. Listening in on that first day was a schoolboy, John Gilmore. He now presents a drive time show on Radio Lancashire, but he remembers the thrill of his hometown coming alive on air.
My dad and my mum had gone out and bought a brand new radiogram, and we had VHF. I was 11 years old at the time. I was off school sick, and I thought, I'll just have a go at tuning this in. And I can remember there was a lot of picking up and a lot of apologising going on while they sorted out these technical problems.
I'm standing at the excavations for the second Mersey Tunnel in Wallasey.
Great, you knew these places, and they were being mentioned on the radio, 8 miles from where you lived.
The river. Big Marmion in Wallasey.
Now the time is 1 o'clock, and it's time to join Tony Wolfe on the River Mersey.
Back, reverse. So there you are, that's Hello Goodbye from the Beatles, and that's their new one, isn't it? Anyway, I've got some fellows here who've got a new one who's doing absolutely marvellously in the charts at the moment. There's, of course, the scaffold. Hello, John, Roger and Mike. Hello, Max.
Hello, Tony Wolfe.
Oh, thank you very much. What do you think of this floating party then?
Blast.
Merseyside's natural gift for words gave it a head start. 40 years on, Roger McGough, one of those members of Scaffold, reflects on how it was.
I really could never get a word in those days.
Oh, listen, tell us, how's the new record going anyway? Round. Yeah. Thank you very
Liverpool were not surprised that they were among the first place to have its own local radio, because the belief up there is that, we're not English, we're Scousers. And so it seemed quite natural to have a Radio Merseyside, to have our own station.
I love your suit, incidentally.
Well, you can marry it.
Thank you very much.
The thing about Liverpool is it's a small place and is sort of tribal, as you know. And you're aware that people who listen to it know you. The other thing about it, I think, of course, was that prior to this, there was the BBC Voice, wasn't there? And I think local radio did bring in the regional accent. It did promote its locals. And so the Scouse voice, and then later on, of course, all over the country, the Geordie and the Scottish voices came onto national radio. Such a good thing.
On that note, thank you very much, John. Hope the record goes really well.
Thank you very much.
And
very much for Radio Merseyside. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you very much for Radio Merseyside. Thank you very, very, very much. Hi.
You could hardly get a sparkier place to launch a station, especially when, as Jim Black recalls, you've got Ken Dodd on tap and willing to go walkabout.
People who were with us and some of the newcomers to Merseyside, gosh, it's amazing, everybody knows Ken. And we were walking through Clayton Square, which is where the old flower sellers used to be, these lovely old ladies. And they overheard this person say, it's amazing, Ken, everybody knows you. And this lovely old lady said, know him, bloody hell, he used to pee in our grid.
Across all 3 news stations, though, listeners had to be won round to the idea of hometown radio.
Look, I haven't heard it.
Why not?
I didn't think I could get it on my television set.
I think there's just a little bit too much pop. I prefer the middle-of-the-road stuff, really.
I don't think it's very good, all that good. Not as good as Radio 1.
I just don't want it.
Some of the old school didn't want it because it was new. Some of the modern 60s go-go generation thought local equalled dreary. Maurice Ennells of Radio Leicester came out fighting.
I think this word parochial is overplayed. One obviously can be too parochial, but
After all, there is a lot of interest, or there should be if there's any community spirit at all. There's a lot of interest in what the man round the corner does, what that incident was that happened the other night. I don't think that we should talk about these items as parochial in this context.
A 16-year-old music-mad teenager was overjoyed when he heard that a beat group he played with was going on its first national tour. But then his dad turned the offer down flat. But now Mr. Sam Pitchford of Ellesmere Port is...
News was hard work, it always is. In those early days, the stations didn't have dedicated newsrooms, and at first people didn't think of contacting them, as they do now. So staff relied on local newspapers for stories. Rosie Kane was a 21-year-old newsroom secretary at Radio Merseyside.
We relied totally on news coming in to the Liverpool Echo. So one of my jobs was at least 3 times a day, rushing round, picking up from the editor's office the news, bringing it back to our news editor, who then in turn rewrote it so that people didn't read in the Liverpool Echo and hear on the radio, word for word, the same story.
Sometimes we used to be a bit suspicious that some of their best stories they held back until they'd published it because they didn't want us to preempt it.
And the only time I think we ever fell off the air was very early one morning. The cleaner, first thing in the morning, she unplugged the jack field, which was, of course, our source of power, and she put the hoover on. And there was nothing going out whatsoever.
Radio Leicester, the time 12:45.
The human voice on the air breeds a curious intimacy, and soon stories and experiences did roll in as a bond grew, local and close-knit, between listener and broadcaster. The same weather, the same crises, affected both sides. Ken Warburton.
I remember one year, it must have been the first year we were on air, there were some quite severe floods in the city. Well, you didn't just report it, you lived it. You were there. You had trouble getting into work. You knew people who'd been flooded out by the stormwaters. And you directly felt, experienced, suffered those elements that the community suffered. So there was a closeness.
That closeness had, and still has, the capacity to lead on to important things on a larger scale. Jim Black presented and produced Radio Merseyside's women's programme, Break Time. And for one show, he invited Freddie Astbury and his mother into the studio. Freddie was the second child in the country to be identified as having been born with defects as a result of thalidomide.
We went live talking to his mother about the problem.
Mrs. Astbury, how many children have you got?
I've got a girl, Rita, aged 13. I've got a boy, aged 10, and Freddie, who is 9 in October.
Hello, Freddie.
Hello.
How are you?
All right, thank you.
Do you play any games?
Yes.
What games do you play?
Snakes and ladders. Freddie was born without arms and legs. The first fight was to get a bathroom and a toilet and a bedroom built downstairs so I wouldn't have to carry my child upstairs.
And do you get any assistance, Mrs. Astbury?
Well, we don't get any assistance off the government.
And you know what it's like with live broadcasting, that if someone breaks down and becomes emotional like that, your first reaction is that you can't go on with this because it's exposing someone in a way that they shouldn't really be exposed. And I was getting very nervous, and I was trying to get to a point where I could stop the transmission and go to something else. And Michael Hancock, the manager, was listening to it up in his office above, and he came rushing down the stairs, came to the window of the cubicle and put both his thumbs up, saying, "Keep going."
It's been a bit of a struggle then, has it?
It's all fight. Myself, I didn't know anything. Everything I found out, I've had to find out myself, and so has all other parents. It's about time this country thought about their own country instead of other people's places.
And I started talking to Freddie while his mother was sobbing by my side.
Freddie, what are you doing now? Are you going to have another glass of milk? Hey?
Not yet.
Not yet? Couldn't you manage another one?
No.
Are you going to say goodbye to the listeners?
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Freddie's story was picked up by the Sunday Times. Its huge international thalidomide campaign followed. The rest is history, but don't forget that it began in that little Liverpool studio. Local radio also democratised the microphone. Listeners could quite easily move in and have a go themselves. Rex Conway was a probation officer who ran a tape recording club in Ashby-de-la-Zouch. Radio Leicester wanted a hobbies slot, so they invited Rex to talk about his love of tape recording with a representative from another club.
The gentleman from the other club was supposed to open the proceedings, and the light went on and his eyes glazed over and nothing came forth. He just couldn't speak. The presenter, who was Dave Chalice, was having apoplexy on the desk, and so I thought, well, something's got to be done, so I interviewed him.
After that, Rex got his own show, a hobbies programme which ran for 2 years.
At present we are sitting in the parish church of Our Lady and St Nicholas at Wanlip.
I covered all sorts of weird and wonderful hobbies, some straightforward, potholing, rowing, archery, model car racing, brass rubbing.
I've found the brass under the paper now, and I've started with the knights.
I think the people in Leicester embraced this station, not only because it was new, but because it gave them a voice.
Desmond has a barrow in the marketplace. Molly is the singer in the band.
Dozens of people got chances to be heard as professionals through local radio. For the first time, there was a career path to follow way outside the capital for budding broadcasters. In Liverpool, 11-year-old John Gilmore found his way onto the air.
I joined the Radio Merseyside Junior Spinners Club, for which you got a certificate with your name and your number. I was Radio Merseyside Junior Spinner number 322. You could take your hamsters and your gerbils in, and you could talk on the radio. Well, this was unknown before, and here I am, 40 years later, working on BBC local radio, and my ambition realised because of the inspiration of BBC Radio Merseyside.
And Nora Clowes, an early listener to Radio Leicester, soon found herself waiting for the green light too.
There used to be a programme in the morning called Coffee Break, which was about 15 minutes.
Hello everyone, I'm Wendy Blair and I'm in charge of Coffee Break.
I came into one programme to take part, and that was about knitting and dressmaking.
There'll be features on your children, your homes, driving, fashion.
I can't remember exactly what the subject... Oh, I know what it was. It was waistbands on a skirt. So it was explained to me how to make the waistband fit. But I was given the advice. It never worked for me, but there we are.
The first 3 local stations were pioneers in other ways. Looking at the real community around them, they responded to it. Sheffield had programmes in Bengali and Urdu, and in Leicester there was a young Jamaican factory worker called Herdle White.
All ethnic people, all black people at that time just assumed that BBC radio or the television was notable for white people.
Reggae, 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 here comes Johnny Reggae.
Herdle's broadcasting career began after his wife, a primary school teacher, contacted Radio Leicester to express her disapproval of the quality of the station's children's programmes. She was invited in to have a go herself, and Herdle drove her into the studio. Before long, he was presenting a weekly 15-minute programme for Leicester's Afro-Caribbean community.
It's reggae time with Herdle White.
At the time, I was working as an engineer turn at Bentley Engineering. We make hosiery machine for the hosiery industry. My lunch was from 12 till 1. And the program that was allocated to me during that time, it was every Wednesday from 12:30 till 12:45. So I clocked out at 12 o'clock from my engineering work, rushed to the radio station, and I ate my sandwich between the records. And sometime, unfortunately, the records were shorter than I expected, and you could hear me finishing my sandwich. So, those were the good old days,
One-time job. Okay, Scotty and Lorna, Breakfast in Bed. It's a fabulous tune. I really liked it. Play that over and over.
I can only speak for Radio Leicester. They have stayed true to what they set out to achieve. Local radio for local people. When you mean local people, not just white folks, but other races of people involved in local station as well.
Stay tuned. Next week we'll be back again. Bye-bye.
The Herdle White Show is still running on Radio Leicester. No sandwiches now. It's from 7 to 10 on Friday nights. Of course, your proximity to listeners can have its disadvantages. They know where you live, as all of us who are on local stations later remember just too well. They come in and have a word when they disagree, especially the local councillors.
There they were, face to face, eyeball to eyeball, which I suppose in a way was better because, you could bring a bit of humanity to your exchange with them. But yes, of course, not only formally knocking on the front door of the station, but informally in the pub, where, yes, you'd be taken to task if you'd done, as they would see it, something inappropriate.
It should be said, though, that although councils were originally the paymasters, local radio stations were always very clear over who had editorial control. Michael Barton.
I was extremely fortunate going to Sheffield to find that the Labour Council, as it was totally clear about one thing, that yes, they were paying the money, but no, they were not going to take any editorial influence at all. The protective mechanism was to have an advisory council, which the government of the day set up.
Now, who's going to have some strong comments on this?
I had the young blind David Blunkett, who was a councillor at the age of 22 in Sheffield, as a member of my advisory council. I had a master cutler, they're from the steel industry. I had the vice-chancellor of the university, and so on. These were the people who were my protection in a way, but they were also my advisors and my keenest critics.
Clearly, some elements within the local community felt under threat from local radio. Remember, there were no new media, internet or satellite, and local newspapers had had a free run for decades. Ken Warburton says that back in those days, Radio Leicester had one very determined opponent.
The Leicester Mercury. I think in the first 2 years of the experiment, we were mentioned once, to the best of my knowledge, and that was on the day of the launch when 2 paragraphs announced that the Minister for Post and Telecommunications was in the town to open a local radio station. Full stop, finish. That was it.
The resentment had been festering for some time. Matthew Linfoot.
There was a lot of local opposition, largely because the decisions had been made without a full meeting of the City Council. The Leicester Mercury stoked up the opposition and printed a series of letters against the project for the radio station. There was one letter which suggested a programme schedule for the new station. 8 o'clock, Songs of Praise from the Leicester City Council Chamber. 4 p.m, Traffic Island Discs. Each week a ratepayer is asked which 8 city councillors he would take with him if they were cast away on a traffic island.
On one occasion when a photograph was taken with the radio car in shot, the airbrush artist down at the Mercury airbrushed it out and painted in a brick wall behind it. Bizarre, really. And again, this day and age, I'm sure relationships are very, very smooth and we coexist in the local environment with the local newspapers. But my goodness, that was tough over those first couple of years.
By June 1968, another 5 local radio stations had opened. BBC's Nottingham, Brighton, Stoke-on-Trent, Durham and Leeds. And by the end of the 2-year experiment, there was a certain relief among the staff.
When I first went to see the station manager, he did explain, of course, that it was only a 2-year experiment. As such, I was only a temporary, in case it didn't work. And so I nicknamed myself the Permanent Temporary. I think after the 2-year experiment came to a close, I could then finally call myself a Permanent Permanent.
You didn't wake up in the morning thinking, oh my goodness, it's an experiment if we don't make it work. I think we were so engaged with well, let's be perfectly honest, the fun of it, because it was fun. It was great. It wasn't like a proper job.
We're from Liverpool and it was Merseyside, so we knew we were successful, yes. That was the attitude all the way through. We were there to have fun. We were there to do what we were destined to do, which was to serve the community, and we did it.
Frank Gillard finally got the all clear to launch local radio in the rest of the country, which is where I and my generation came in. I was a student broadcaster and then an assistant on Radio Oxford, and I learned to enjoy the peculiar comradeship that comes of going through crises with your audience. Rota power cuts, droughts, floods, royal visits, funfairs that block up the town's centre. However, back in 1969, one important thing changed. Frank Gillard knew he couldn't rely on council funding, so he persuaded the government to allow local broadcasting to be paid out of the licence fee. It still is, which ensures independence and stability, albeit on a bit of a shoestring. There are now 40 BBC local stations in England and 7.5 million listeners a week. Frank Gillard lived to celebrate local radio's 30th birthday.
The critics of the 1960s, who denigrated the local radio proposals as just parish pumpery and petty parochialism, have been confounded, really. What I hoped for was something warmer and more accessible, friendly radio. The stations have put down roots in their communities and reflect the totality of their lives.
21st century local radio has changed in tone, of course, as all broadcasting has. There's far more pop and chat now, and certainly those cut-glass, faintly patronising home service voices are gone. But the essential intimacy remains.
It's 10 o'clock on BBC Radio Sheffield. I'm Tom Green. You're listening to a late show special on the day the floods came to South Yorkshire. Let's get all the latest.
Got no power. We've run out of food. So it's getting a bit critical.
When you see your street floating, we're unreal. I think most people are in shock.
I think Frank would be delighted today, if he were alive, about local radio and about what it's doing. You only have to go to any of those communities where local radio operates and talk to the people whose lives are conditioned and helped and fostered by their local radio station. It's their comfort. It helps those who live alone, and many people do, and for whom those friendly voices coming out of the loudspeaker, who breathe the same air as they do listening at home, those are the people who can judge the value and the worth of the station to them.
Ask anyone how it was after Hillsborough, or the 87 hurricane, or bombings, or snows, or floods, or the drought, and the odds are they will have got information and help and a sense of fellow feeling by tuning to their local station.
Well, I've phoned up to offer my washing machine.
What do you think, Ruth?
Oh, that would be fantastic.
It's not that there's anything callous or elitist or snobbish about network radio, perish the thought. It's just that local radio fills a need for something close to home.
Tomorrow looks like a tricky day. The weather forecast is not overly good for us, but we'll be out there fighting. The people of Sheffield will be out there fighting, and we will sort this out.
Close to home, the story of local radio was presented by Libby Purves and produced by Paula McGinley.